Dobbiamo con calma mescolarsi, non dimenticare.
And so passes Socrates. A sacrifice of a rooster to the god of Shelpius, a final act of piety from the man being condemned to death for impiety. Don't be too sad though, everyone else in that room also died. They just didn't all die as well as Socrates did. Alright, so there's lots more to talk about in that dialogue than was in that little video. This dialogue begins with a man named Socrates asking someone named Phaedo about the death of Socrates. So it's a couple levels removed from a direct recounting of the matter, by which Plato is indicating to us that, sure, he's putting some of his own thoughts into this dialogue, and it's not a strict recount of what Socrates necessarily said, although I'm sure it's fairly accurate. Of course, it's also done this way, no doubt, because Plato was... where? Was he there? At the death? No. It says he was ill. He called in sick. Kind of lame. Kind of lame, Plato, but maybe he knew he just couldn't handle it. Or maybe he actually was sick. I'm sure he wasn't much of a liar. Anyway, long story short, it is a couple levels removed, but that's really not that important to know. All that really matters is the ideas that are discussed in it. But I do have a couple things noted here in my own annotations before we dive into the heavy material. Phaedo says, very well then, after Socrates asked him to recount the whole matter, I myself was curious, and Phaedo obviously was there. He says, I myself was curiously affected while I was there. It wasn't pity that visited me, as one might have expected for someone present at the death of an intimate friend. Because the man seemed to me happy, Socrates, both in his manner and in his words. So fearlessly and nobly was he meeting his end. And so I felt assured that even while on his way to Hades, he would not go without divine providence, and that when he arrived there, he would fare well, if anyone ever did. So, Socrates' whole demeanor, all we have, of course, is the text of his words, but those present said that his whole demeanor exuded confidence in what he was saying. It wasn't just talk for the sake of talking. Those there simply felt like he was going to be fine for some reason. He exuded that. So I recall, of course, here, just as I did in the beginning of the Crito dialogue, the same thing, the fruits of a good philosophy. Socrates' philosophy is a very good one, and so we see the fruits of good philosophy in his own life. Anyway, to what Socrates himself says. Before he gets into his arguments, I took note of something very significant. He says, very well then, let me try to defend myself more convincingly before you than I did before the jury, that I expect to join the company of good men. Why, I am not resentful, but rather am hopeful that there is something in store for those who've died. All right. So those who are at his death are asking him why he's so confident, why is he so at peace, why is he so calm? Well, he has his reasons for expecting something good. He's going to present those reasons, but most significant, I think, of what he just said was, let me defend myself more convincingly than I did before the jury. In other words, in the apology of Socrates, in the trial. What was at stake during his trial? Yeah, his life. It was life and death. What's at stake now? Nothing. And you could say he's just saying that, but I believe him. What is he saying there? He's saying, I care more about convincing a few of my friends of the truth and consoling them with that truth than I do about saving my own life. I believe him. And this is certainly a longer dialogue. I gave you guys a very abridged version. This is not to say it necessarily was this long in real life, but I'm sure it was lengthy. And he cares more about presenting his argument well now when nothing is at stake seemingly, than he did during his trial when everything was at stake, seemingly. So he is, shall we say, as genuine and sincere as they come. All right. And what is his argument? Well, that he, as I said, as I quoted, expects to join the company of good men, that there is something in store for those who died. In fact, as we've long been told, something far better for the good than for the wicked. He says, as we've long been told. This was 2,500 years ago. Before the biggest religions of the world today even existed. Before just about any cultures that exist today even existed. As we've long been told. Every religion, every culture, every time, every place, with incredibly few exceptions, and I say this drawing from my semesters teaching comparative religion as well, teaches basically the same gist. There's something after you die. It's good if you're good. It's bad if you're bad. That's pretty much unanimous across history, time, and place. But up until Socrates, it had always been just kind of taken for granted by almost everybody, or rejected by some, certainly. But it was never really reasoned about deeply one way or the other. This is a first. The first real, in-depth, logical treatment of the question of the immortality of the soul, considering arguments for and against. So this is groundbreaking. Not only is it groundbreaking in that it's the first, but it's still, to this day, incredibly insightful. All right. Before he launches into his various dialogues with Simius and others, he is warned not to talk much. Why? It's a weird theory, but poison, yeah. It's good. Apparently, the executioner says it's going to make the poison work more slowly, which is going to make your death be much more painful. Why that would be the case, I don't know, but they were convinced that was the case, and Socrates couldn't care less about that. And I find that significant, worth noting, because some people will say they're not afraid of death, they're just afraid of pain, and the pain leading up to death. Well, Socrates isn't afraid of that either. He'd much rather have a painful death and have one more chance to philosophize than a painless death, but missing that chance to philosophize. And I find that significant as well. All right. Now then, with you from my jury. Oh, sorry, I also noted here. He says, just let him prepare 3 times as much poison if necessary to kill me. Anyway, now he says, with you from my jury, to those present, I want to give my defense, and show with what good reason, as it seems to me, that a man who has truly spent his life in philosophy feels confident when about to die, and is hopeful that, when he has died, he will win very great benefits in the other world. All who actually engage in philosophy correctly are practicing nothing other than dying and being dead. So if you feel like you're dying right now in this class, that's good. It's not just because I'm boring. It's because you're doing philosophy right. You're dying. Why?
Prepping your soul for it.
Yeah, you are. Socrates says you're literal. I try to not use the word literally when it's not intended, but he seems to mean it literally, that you are dying when you're philosophizing. You are all dying now because you are, well, not just that every second's getting us closer to death, that's certainly true, but the point is, in philosophy practiced correctly, which is not only attaining the wisdom, but living in accordance with it, you are separating the soul from the body. Which is just another word for death, the separation of the soul and the body. We'll get to more metaphysical ramifications of that soon, but good philosophy, the philosophy of Callicles, does the opposite. It makes you more and more enslaved. It makes your soul more and more enslaved to the needs of the body, the demands of the body. But philosophy, as Socrates encourages it, enables one to pursue virtue, and especially the virtue of temperance, all the virtues, but certainly it enables the higher desires, the desires for truth and goodness and beauty, to overrule those lower desires of the body, the lusts and the passions and desires for comfort and money. And practicing that is a sort of separation of your soul from your body, Socrates says. So really, you are not only preparing for death with philosophy, but you are actually dying. Which is not the best way to advertise philosophy, maybe. Sign up for this course if you want to die. That would come across as a threat. I shouldn't change the course description to be that on the course catalog. But now that I really have enough time to phrase it in the way that Socrates means it, with you all here, you can see what he's getting at. And my goodness, whether or not he's right on that this is how you prepare for death, and that's certainly out for debate, it's the one, what is the only thing you know about the future, about your future? The only thing you know about your future is that you're going to die. The only thing any of us know about our future is that we're going to die. We think we know hundreds and thousands of things about what's going to happen to us, but none of it's for sure. A comet could crash into this room right now, we could all be instantly dead. I hope that doesn't happen, but the point is, it's strange that the one thing that's taboo to talk about, and in philosophy we do obviously talk about taboo things, the one thing that's awkward and embarrassing and supposed to be ignored at all costs and never brought up is the fact that we're all going to die. And it's the only thing we know, and it's the only thing that we zealously avoid preparing for. We prepare for everything. We have insurance for every stupid little thing that we can conceive of happening to us that won't actually happen to us, and yet we don't even prepare for the only inevitability. Well, Socrates will have none of that. He's encouraging us to philosophize as our preparation for death. Not saying that's necessarily the best or the only way, but it's a way. All right. Simmias laughed. So even though hearing him at that time find it funny, and they're kind of glad that at this tense moment that Socrates is able to ease the setting a bit, but he means it because it is a separation of the soul from the body. All right, let's talk, as I said, about the metaphysics of this a bit. Before we can make any meaning of the separation from the soul from the body, we need to talk a little bit about what is meant by that word, by that concept, soul. We all, of course, have heard it plenty of times, and we've doubtless all used that word before, but how can we have a bit of a more solid philosophical understanding of what is referred to by it? Well, the clearest way to define the soul in philosophical terms, again, this is not intended to be controversial, religious, or theological, this is purely philosophical, the form of the body. So here's one way we can have down of understanding what is meant by the soul, even if you prefer to call it something else. The form of the body. And you are starting to see now, perhaps, why we had to have our forms discussion before this. This is the most important concept for this whole dialogue, the idea of a form. It's going to be his most important argument for the immortality of the soul as well, as we'll see shortly, his argument from the affinity with the forms. But before we can talk about the soul's affinity with the forms, we need to talk about it itself as a sort of form. All right, form of the body. So recall from that discussion we had last class that Aristotle, rightly I think, distinguishes all being as a composite of form and matter. Each thing has a material cause and it has a formal cause. The formal cause is that which it is. You don't need all this down now. The material cause is that out of which it comes to be. They are two distinct realities. Now, nobody would deny that things have a form in as much as they at least have a configuration. The desk, the example I always use because there's always desks handy during class, but it of course has matter. It came to be from a set of a hunk of metal and wood and plastic, but then a form is imposed upon the matter to turn it into a desk. So if someone points at that and asks you what it is, you say desk, you don't say wood, metal, plastic, even though that's a valid answer. It's not the best answer. The best answer is desk because that's what it is, because that is its form. But in this case, its form, there's all sorts of different categories of forms. There's all sorts of different levels of forms. That we didn't get into much depth on last discussion, but that question is the key question for this discussion. Because if I were to destroy this desk, where would its form be? If I just burned it, like completely annihilated this desk as much as possible, its form wouldn't exist anymore, would it? Because its form is just its configuration. There's nothing transcendent or self-existing about its form. And these are the two key qualifiers that we need to ask about the soul as the form of the body. Is it transcendent and self-existing? And you don't need these down, but I'm going to put these down on the board just to remind us of them. Transcendent, self-existing. Is the soul, as the form of the body, transcendent and self-existing from the body? Clearly it's tied to the body, but is it necessarily tied to the body? In the case of a desk, it is. The form of, I don't think anyone argues that this desk's existence perseveres beyond its material existence, because the form and the matter there are too deeply linked. They are only one thing, and one cannot have an existence aside from the other. Form, so the soul, is it like that or not? Well, that's what we're going to have to talk about. But suffice it to say that some forms are not so tied to the matter that they are gone if the matter is destroyed, or that they are substantially altered if the matter is substantially altered. Let me give you another example. A book, a story. I'll just whip out the book I have handy here, all the complete corpus of Plato's dialogues. Well, let's pretend this were actually an engaging novel, which some of the dialogues are, in a sense. We have a matter and a form, all being can be referred to in accordance with its matter and its form, but a story is a helpful analogy here because the matter, well, what's the matter of a story in this case at least? It's words, and if we go even more material, if we consider it in an even more material aspect, it's just ink upon a page. That is its matter. But to simply dismiss the form of a thing as just its matter, that's not an argument, it's just a dismissal. For example, if you get a text message from your significant other and it says just like 2 words, maybe 3 words, maybe more, it's over with us. Can you say, oh, that's just pixels? It's just pixels and screen. That's all that is. That doesn't, I can't conclude anything from pixels. Well, of course you can't say that. Yes, it's pixels, but it's more than that. It means something. It refers to something beyond itself. The form and the matter are not always as mundanely linked as that of the configuration of a material object. Sometimes they have a distinct type of existence. So even more so the case with a story. The words, the ink on the page, that would be the matter of the story. But of course the story itself, let me ask you this, what if I decreased the font or increased the font size? If I doubled the font size of a given book, what would that do to the story? Nothing at all. Why? Yeah, it's the same exact story. The story has a degree of existence as the form of the ink on the page. It has a degree of existence that begins to transcend the matter. Not as much, I wager, as the soul, but we're starting to see that not all forms are so mundanely linked to the matter. It exists. Well, let me ask the same question now about human beings, and this will lead into other considerations of the same thing. If you, heaven forbid, get into a car accident and the drive home, a very bad one, and lose all of your limbs, you have just lost over half of your body mass. Are you now less than half of the person that you were before the car accident? Just materially, but you're the exact same person you were before. Your life just changed a lot, unfortunately, but you are the same exact person. If you're married, you're still married to the same spouse. You still have the same convictions, the same ideas. You are still bound by the same contracts. You have the same... Anyway, I don't need to go through the whole list. Obviously, you're the same person. We see in the case of a human being, certainly, not just a human being, any being, there is a type of transcendence between the matter and the form. Just how far does that transcendence go? We're going to need to look at some arguments that Socrates makes to get an idea. But before we get to them, let's get down a couple other ways that we could comprehend what is meant by the soul. Essence, we already talked about form and matter last discussion, form being essence. Well, it naturally, logically follows that the form would be the essence, and that the soul, therefore, would be the essence of the person. In other words, that which is referred to when you refer to the person. So we all know that we have bodies, no one denies that, but we also seem to all know that that is not our essence. Why? Because, well, let me ask you a related question to the one I just asked. I think I asked you this in a different discussion a couple classes ago. I can't remember what the context was when I first asked it, but I'll ask it again because it's very relevant now. You look at a picture of yourself when you're 2 years old, and you say, that's me. What justifies that assertion, that conclusion that that is you? Memories epistemologically justify it. But what metaphysically justifies it? What actually gives you the logical basis for asserting that is me when you don't share a single cell in common with that person? You don't share any matter, as I said, unless you've never cut your hair or trimmed your fingernails. You don't share a single cell, and those, I don't even suppose those would count because they're really dead and they're not really a part of you anyway. You don't share a single cell in common with that person that you're referring to when you look at a picture of yourself when you're 2 years old. Because, of course, biologists tell us, and I'll take their word for it, that every cell, that your whole body goes through a whole cycle of cells every 7 years. So no matter, you have no matter in common with that person, and yet you still say, that's me. Rightfully so. I'm not saying you should stop saying that. I agree with you in saying that's me. But you have no logical basis for saying that's me unless there is something, thinking back to the pre-Socratics, what? That hasn't changed. Something that's still substantially the same now as it was then. So if it's not the matter, what are we left with? The form. Now you could argue that it's just the form in the sense of configuration, not in the sense of transcendent self-existing. What configuration, what fundamental configuration do you share with the person in that picture of yourself at 2 years old? Same what? Yeah, hair, which all derives from your parents, yeah, genetics, your DNA. You have the same DNA. So someone could, in accordance with everything I've said so far, argue, well, sure, that's still you, and sure, it's not matter, but it's the form, it's a rather lowly form, just configuration. In other words, your DNA. But here's the problem with that. What do identical twins share exactly? DNA. They have the exact same DNA. Are they the exact same person? No. Any identical twins here? No. I've asked this in classes in years past and have had identical twins there, and they've asserted directly, yes, I am definitely not the same person as my twin. Thank you for acknowledging that. And obviously identical twins are not the same people. Sure, they share a lot in common, but they are clearly different people, and they will not take very kindly to anyone asserting that they are the same person as their twin, because they're not. So it's not that mysterious thing that we identify as the essence of the person that transcends the individual years of our earthly existence. Whatever it is, it's not the matter, and it's not such a lowly form as a mere configuration by way of DNA. It's something else. It's either something else, or we should stop saying that. We always have to be logically consistent, of course, as philosophers. Some philosophers have followed the line of reasoning this far, and instead of concluding the common sense thing that, yeah, we do have a soul that's transcendent and self-existing, they've concluded that one's personal identity does not persist for very long. In fact, some modern philosophers have argued that you're only the same person for about 30 minutes at a time, actually. I don't know how they came up with that, and I think we all know that's absurd. That's what happens when you detach philosophy from common sense. But anyway, it has been argued. And I commend their willingness to try to be logically consistent with certain premises, but it would make a little more sense, I wager, my own humble opinion here, to just follow it in the direction that confirms what we all kind of already know. That we do have an existence that transcends the matter and is real. All right, how else can we consider this? This one's interesting. Life principle of the body. Socrates is going to use this concept of the soul in some of his arguments. But this doesn't apply to just human beings. This applies to any living thing. So we can't use this argument to distinguish humans from other beings, from other animals and plants. I'm not saying they're indistinguishable. I'm just saying this particular argument doesn't work for that. But that's okay. It still works in demonstrating that there's something transcendent about the form of a living thing. Why? Well, when you have a thing, even with a very complex form, think of a computer, very complex form. Your car, very complex form. But as complex as its form is, it's still just a configuration of parts. It's not a life principle. Why? Well, when your car breaks, do you wait for it to heal? No. Because its form is just its configuration and nothing else. And once that configuration has been distorted, there is no principle that transcends that configuration that can restore it to that configuration, or at least that can direct the restoration thereof. And yet, when you are injured, you might go to the doctor, maybe, or if you're infected with a bacteria, you might go to the doctor. What does the doctor do? Does he fix you? No, he doesn't at all, does he? I'm a big fan of doctors. I'm not criticizing doctors here, but they don't fix you. They do what? Yeah, they give you stuff that helps what? Helps your body fix itself. All the best doctors in the world, all they can do is remove an impediment to your body healing itself. You know, think of the easiest fix for just about anything is if you're fortunate enough to have some infection that an antibiotic can quickly cure. The antibiotic does not cure the infection. It does what? Kills a bunch of things. Your body happens to be stronger than the infection that you're suffering from. So the antibiotic comes in and just kills a bunch of stuff, which happens to thankfully kill the infection. That doesn't heal you. Your body heals itself. Once the infection is gone, your body can do a better job healing itself. It doesn't do anything to heal you. Your body does that. Not your body, though. The life principle of your body does it. Now, you might rightfully protest, but hold on, don't we know what healing is? Like, white blood cells do this, and there's all these processes, and biochemists can do a great job explaining the various things that happen during healing. Well, yes, they can. They can describe the material and formal causality of the processes themselves, but they can't describe the efficient and final causes. When a body heals itself, yeah, we can see what's happening, but it's very mysterious as to why it does it. It's almost like it's taking orders from something outside of itself. They can't explain why all of these things do what they do. They just do it. There's something beyond the body itself that wants to return the body to a given order. For one thing to work to return something else to a given order, the origin of that restoration must itself be transcendent from the thing being restored. Otherwise we have a circular chain, which would be completely illogical, and it would suppose that some sort of effect can explain itself, which we know isn't the case. Nothing explains itself. The cause of everything is outside of itself. So this is fascinating. Socrates is going to use this idea of the soul as the life of the body in some of his arguments. One more. This one's morbid, but it'll really help, I think, give you an image for the soul. The substantial difference between, well, what do you think? Substantial difference between what and what? You and, none of you have this yet, but you will one day. Your corpse. And you might say, hold on, a corpse is a disgusting, rotting thing. I am a living, breathing, heart-beating, fresh human being. I am not disintegrating. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about with no time transpiring between the emergence of the matter as a corpse. In other words, the very instant of death, without so much as a millisecond having passed. This, of course, presupposes something. To say that the soul is the substantial difference between you and your corpse presupposes, I admit, that there is a substantial difference between you and your corpse. But I think we've already done enough explaining in the previous items here that we can presuppose that, at least for this last definition. Well, let me back up. Taking a computer as an analogy for a human being, what do you do to a computer to kill it? Just unplug it, turn it off. You could pour water on it if you're really angry at your computer, which I often am and have been very tempted to do. I've somehow been able to restrain myself, but I have done some very unvirtuous things to my computer in the past. Not my current one. Memories. So your computer dies if you unplug it. Quote, dies, analogously. Or let's take a different example. Your computer dies if a single circuit on it fails, and the failure of that single little circuit, it's not a major problem. You can easily and inexpensively replace it, but it still shuts down your computer and, quote, kills it. Okay, so your computer is now dead. There is no substantial difference between your computer when it was alive and when it's now, quote, dead. It's just the same exact substantial, essential thing. At one time, its software and hardware is running. In other words, it has electricity flowing through it. And at another time, it doesn't. Those are accidental. Those are what we call in philosophy accidental differences, not substantial differences. The difference between a computer that is on and off is accidental, not substantial. It is not a different type of being when it is on and when it is off. Why? Because there isn't a substantial difference to even refer to here. In other words, your computer has no soul. Even if Siri pretends she has a soul, or Alexa, or whatever name they give the software, it doesn't have a soul. It doesn't have a substantial difference between being on and off. It's just a question of whether there's electrons flowing through the circuitry. Now, here's the thing. One who denies the transcendent self-existing nature of the soul, or maybe even denies its immortality, would say, but that's the same thing with a person. Well, let's follow that logically. If that is the case with a human being, if there is no transcendent self-existing soul, then that's true. Then in that case, there would be no substantial difference between you and your corpse. It's just like a computer that's on or off. Now, the fortunate thing with a computer, well, let me put it this way. What's the unfortunate thing about the case of a human being then? We can't turn it back on. But what if we could someday? Well, this is not science fiction anymore. When your computer dies, either because there's been a power outage, or you turn it off, or you unplug it, or maybe some small circuitry in it dies, and even though if it's inexpensive to replace, do you then say, "Oh, my computer's dead. I need to move on. I am going to just bury it. I'm gonna leave it outside. I'm gonna let it rust and rot and decompose"? Of course not. You preserve your computer safe, dry, sound, out of harm. You keep it in your office because you plan to get it fixed, to turn it back on. You know that's possible because what? Nothing left. Nothing substantial. There was no substantial being that departed from your computer when it died. It was just an accidental change in its operation. You all know that, which is why you don't give up on your computer when it dies. You keep it safe, clean, and dry so you can fix it when the time comes, when you can afford to do so or when you have time to do so. You probably see where I'm going with this now. What do we do when we die? Do we keep ourselves clean and dry and safe so we can get fixed when the time comes? Some people do. What am I talking about?
Talking about when comas. Sometimes.
What's that?
Comas. People go into a coma.
Oh, coma, yeah.
Yeah. Or they're donating their organs.
That, yeah. Okay. That's noble. But I'm actually thinking now of something a little more rare, but it's happening. Freezing. Cryogenic freezing. This is no longer science fiction. People are doing this. And it's perfectly rational to do if you believe there is no substantial difference between you and your corpse. If there is no soul as the form of the body that is transcendent and self-existing and that leaves when you die, if there's nothing substantial that departs from you, from your body when you die, then there obviously is no substantial difference between you and your corpse. And you need to keep that matter safe. You need to keep it from deteriorating so that when the time comes, it can be turned back on. It's perfectly logical, following from the premises, which I believe are flawed, but it's valid logic. So it's really important that you do this if you don't believe in a transcendent self-existing soul, because this is your only hope for immortality then. If nothing left, then there's no difference, and your chance of immortality is to prevent the matter from decaying. I don't blame people who do this if they don't believe, again, in the transcendent self-existing soul that leaves upon death. But I do not recommend dedicating your life to storing up however many hundreds of thousands of dollars this takes. It'd be much better living life in the without saving up for freezing your body, because I hope that Socrates can convince you that there is a transcendent self-existing soul that departs when you die, and that is immortal on its own and doesn't need cryogenic freezing to help its immortality. I haven't proven that logically yet. Socrates is going to try to in the upcoming minutes, but remember, these universal human intuitions ought not be lightly discarded. And if you just feel that something's ridiculous, if you just can't shake the thought that something's utterly ridiculous, maybe that feeling is directed at something true. If you just can't shake the thought that it would be ridiculous to freeze yourself when you die, maybe it's because you know that something left when you die. And that something is the real you. And you can't get it back by keeping a body frozen and trying to fix it later. My last class where we talked about this, I had a student who was working at a nursing home, and that was her job, and someone had just died in her arms just recently before the class, and she said that she could just feel something leave. And I've never had someone die in my arms, so I certainly can't personally testify to that. But I hear this a lot, not just from my students, but from anybody who's been in the presence of a dying person. They can just tell that something left. Something substantial left the room. There was even a bunch of studies, and I don't think I believe them, but I'll mention them anyway, that tried to weigh this process. Has anyone heard of this? I don't think this transcendent self-existing soul has weight, so I'm guessing, I can't help but assume they just missed something. But apparently they argue that they accounted for every possibility. And they kept weighing, I don't know who agreed to die on a scale, but All these people died and they got weighed before and after, and there's like 21 grams missing every time. They said they accounted for any possible exhaling of gas anywhere and any other way that they would lose this mysterious 21 grams upon their death. But so I don't know. Take it for what it's worth. It's interesting at the minimum. So, back to the dialogue here. Socrates goes back and forth a bit with Simmias here on the nature of philosophy as the separation of the soul from the body, even before the literal death of the body. He says, do you think it befits a philosophical man to be keen about the so-called pleasures of food and drink? Not in the least, Socrates, said Simmias. And what about those of sex? Not at all. And what about the other services to the body? Do you think that such a philosophical person regards them as of any value? The possession of smart clothes and shoes, and the other bodily adornments? Do you think that he values them highly, or does he disdain them, except insofar as he's absolutely compelled to share in them? Simmias responds, I think the genuine philosopher disdains them. God bless you. Do you think in general, then, that such a person's concern is not for the body, but is directed toward the soul? Simmias responds, I do. Then, Socrates says, it is clear that, first, in such matters as those, the philosopher differs from other people in releasing his soul as far as possible from its communion with the body. Simmias says, it appears so. All right, fair enough. Aristotle, by the way, I'll just say now, although this will probably come up again, has a much more pro-body view of philosophy. Socrates might turn you off a bit here and how staunchly anti-body he's being, but give him some credit. He's about to die. He's got to kind of focus on the glories of that which is beyond the bodily. But Aristotle comes in, as always, and gives the happy medium and points out, look, the pleasure is good, the body is good. And Socrates doesn't absolutely deny that usually. He's usually also on board with this. But the point is, you must, as Cicero says, live to eat, not eat. We must eat to live, not live to eat. The goods of the body must be completely subservient to the goods of the soul, and one must never pursue the goods of the body in contradiction to the goods of the soul. That would be the more balanced view here than what Socrates is espousing. All right, he brings up the forms next for a little bit. Not too much in these first few pages here, but he points out that, look, there are these things that are not seen, the invisible. It is higher than the visible, it is greater than the visible, and the philosopher dedicates himself primarily to these things, and between the soul and the body, it is the soul primarily that is inclined towards these things because it is more like them. He ends his, shall we call it a diatribe against the body here by saying, it affords us countless distractions owing to the nurture it must have. It fills us up with lusts and desires, with fears and fantasies of every kind, and with any amount of trash, so that really and truly we are, as the saying goes, never able to think of anything at all because of it. Thus, it's nothing but the body and its desires that brings wars and factions and fighting, because it's over the gaining of wealth that all wars take place. Anybody get the bonus? That was a hard one. Really snuck in the middle of the paragraph there. But Socrates says boldly here, it is over the gaining of wealth that all wars take place, and indeed that does seem to be the case. It's primarily money that drives them, even if they're given some other superficial motive. You see a lot of people blending religion for war, and no doubt some are because of that, but there was a historian recently who went all throughout history and carefully analyzed every war that has ever happened. And he said 96-point-something% of them had nothing to do with religion in their motivation, but primarily money. Socrates was on to something here. The gaining of wealth. But we also have to, even if he's being a bit extreme anti-body, we got to see the wisdom in what he's saying also. That it fills us up with all manner of distractions, so that we never really succeed in dedicating ourselves to what we want, because we're always being distracted by the needs and the desires of the body, and he's kind of right. You know, did anyone wake up this morning just philosophizing, just thinking about goodness and truth and beauty and justice and nobility and friendship and how to best pursue these things and just how glorious they are. No. Well, maybe you did. That'd be awesome if you did. Sorry if you did and I just contradicted that. But I didn't. I woke up really wanting to go back to bed, really wanting to go to the bathroom, which were contradictory things. It's the other problem with the desires of the body. They're always contradicting each other. The higher desires don't do that because they all work in concert with each other. More on that later. And I really wanted candy. I didn't have any candy in my house, but I really wanted it. Like, these are the things that we wake up wanting. These are the things that we are naturally inclined towards wanting. Because the body's always dragging us down towards things that aren't necessarily wrong in themselves. Some of them aren't. But are at least distractions, as Socrates says here. Distractions from what we really want to dedicate ourselves to. So remember, he is trying to point out to his listeners that he is genuinely eager. He is genuinely excited to be freed from the body. Because Socrates wants nothing more than wisdom, and he knows full well that the body has often distracted him from that. And Socrates himself is admitting this, even though he was more detached from the needs of the body than just about anyone. I mean, he would often barely eat anything, and he had no desire for money, but the closer one gets to this kind of moral perfection, the more obvious, the more clearly one can see one's own faults, even if they're very small. There's a saying, it only takes a small thread to keep a bird from flying. And the more aware one gets, the more one strives after virtue, again, the better one's vision becomes with these things, and the more you can see small defects. And Socrates wishes he was rid of all of them, of course. But it's funny, the people who have the most defects tend to be the people who can't see any defects in themselves. Because if one doesn't even concern oneself at all with what is good and true, one will not see his own flaws. Therefore, while we live, Socrates says, it would seem that we shall be closest to knowledge in this way, if we consort with the body as little as possible, and do not commune with it, except insofar as we must. Do not infect ourselves with its nature, but remain pure from it, until God himself shall release us. Okay, this brings up a huge, what do they call it, pink elephant sitting in the living room. Socrates is spending all this time, and is going to spend all this time, arguing that he has no fear of death, that death can be a wonderful thing for one who is prepared for it, that he expects to join the company of good men, that he expects it to be an excellent afterlife, all this stuff, which all begs the question, why not? And they ask him this in the dialogue itself, but he doesn't spend much time addressing it. Why not hasten it? Why not do it yourself? Why not, in other words, why not commit suicide then, if death is such a great thing? Well, the most obvious reason that Socrates doesn't give, I don't know why he doesn't, is he spent his whole life proving that injustice is the one thing you must never do. Injustice is failing to render what is due. Killing yourself would be the ultimate injustice against yourself. It would be quite ironic to depart from this earth by way of an act that is directly contrary to the very preparation one must have for leaving this earth, according to Socrates. Anyway, he doesn't say that. I wish he did. Suicide wasn't as big of a problem in his day, but it is a huge problem today. And this needs to be briefly addressed here because, again, there's not enough of it in the dialogue. All he really says is we must respect somebody. I can't remember where exactly in here it is. But somebody asks him, okay, why not hasten it? Why not hasten death yourself? All he says is because we must respect the will of the gods. And that's well and good. But the issue of suicide philosophically needs to be addressed. And I always do this. I always read a brief quote whenever we get to this point in this dialogue in my intro Phil classes. Some people hate that I read this quote, but I've had student after student effusively thank me for reading it also, so I always do. This quote I'm going to read is only a short paragraph. It's from Chesterton, the man who wrote one of the articles I gave you in the beginning of the semester. It's dealing with the issue of suicide, very boldly and bluntly, very starkly. These are not the words, what I'm going to read to you now are not the words I would recommend that you share with someone who's struggling with suicidal thoughts. That kind of a person needs a friend, needs to be loved, needs someone close to them. They need gentleness. But the issue of suicide needs to be dealt with very firmly, and that's what Chesterton does here. He says, not only is suicide an injustice, it is the injustice. It is the ultimate and absolute evil, the refusal to take an interest in existence, the refusal to take an oath of loyalty to life. The man who kills a man, kills a man. The man who kills himself, kills all men. As far as he is concerned, he wipes out the world. His act is worse, symbolically considered, than any terrorist's outrage, for he destroys all buildings. The thief is satisfied with diamonds, but the suicide is not. That is his crime. He cannot be bribed, even by the blazing stones of the celestial city. The thief compliments the things he steals, though not the owner of them. But the suicide insults everything on earth by not stealing it. He insults every flower for refusing to live for its sake. I have that last line bolded in my notes. He insults every flower by refusing to live for its sake. That the smallest flower is a thing of such goodness and beauty that is worth living for. And he's right. And if a single flower is, then there's certainly much else out there that is worth living for, no matter how hard life has become. Never forget that. Anyway, back to the dialogue here. I wish Socrates shared more of his own thoughts on suicide, but he didn't, so we go with Chesterton. Okay, on to the objections. So he spent all this time talking about how excited he is, but now his audience has some objections to the immortality of the soul. They don't want to bother him with them at first, considering that he's the one about to die, but they are much more fearful than he is. They're the ones crying and weeping. Socrates is the only one in the whole room who never cried during this whole event. But he insists that they share their concerns with him, so he does. What you say about the soul is a subject of much disbelief, Cebes. This is one of the people there, Cebes. He says, people fear that when it's been separated from the body, it may no longer exist anywhere, but that on the very day the person dies, it may be destroyed and perish. All right, so what if it's not immortal? What if there is, whatever this life principle of the body is, whatever it is that makes us different from our corpse, whatever it is our essence, that's all well and good to define it, but what if it's not immortal? Then this is all kind of for naught, all of this looking forward to death. Socrates never once argues that one should be excited at the prospect of death because he is immortal, because of energy, or because of his legacy living on, or because of his memory, or because of the good things he leaves in the world. That's all a pathetic substitute for actual immortality. He wants actual, literal immortality, as we all do. And remember, this is nothing about energy. I get that time and time again in students' papers, and I hate to break it to you, but as an engineer, I can say the second law of thermodynamics guarantees the ultimate dissipation of all energy after a finite period of time. There's no hope for immortality in energy. It has been said that energy cannot be created or destroyed. In a sense, it can't be, but it can be infinitely dissipated to the point that there's no order left within it whatsoever. And that goes for any energy at all, even the smallest quantum particles of it. So Socrates is arguing for a sort of literal immortality here. And he's not simply asserting it as a belief. He's got very interesting arguments for it. And that will lead us to our next question here. Okay, so Socrates' first argument that he's going to give is called his argument from opposites. And let me read a few of the key points he makes regarding his argument from opposites. I'm just going to run through it real quick, and then I will try to make more sense of this in layman's terms, and then I'll give you something on the board that you can have for your notes. So don't stress about following all these details. We will make more sense of it in the upcoming minutes. Launching into his exposition of his arguments, he says, well, I really don't think anyone listening now, even if you were a comic poet, would say that I'm talking idly and arguing about things that don't concern me. If you agree, then, we shall look into the matter. Obviously, this is about as relevant as it gets. This is a rather fitting time for him to have a dialogue about the immortality of the soul. And a cynic might say this is just an invention of Plato, but I don't believe that. I think this really happened, even if it wasn't the same in all of the details. And I'm sure that this is what Socrates was philosophizing about and doing in his final moments. Okay. He says, opposites come to be only from their opposites. In the case of all things that actually have an opposite, that is, as for example, the beautiful is the opposite, of course, of the ugly, the just, the unjust, and so on in countless other cases. And there is an opposite to life, or is there none? Cebes responds, there is. What is it? Death. Socrates says, now the soul absolutely will never admit the opposite of what it brings up, as has been agreed earlier. Most emphatically, says Cebes. What do we call whatever doesn't admit death? Socrates says, well, immortal. But the soul doesn't admit death? No. Then the soul is immortal. Well, may we say it has been proved? Yes, very adequately proved, Socrates. I skipped a lot, which is why you might wonder why they're settling so easily on it seeming proved. I'm just reading a couple excerpts here before I give you a little bit of a summary of the argument. Socrates continues, though. Are we compelled to say the same thing about the immortal? If the immortal is also imperishable, it's impossible for the soul, whenever death attacks it, to perish. Because it follows from what's been said before that it won't admit death, nor will it be dead. Just as we said, 3 will not be even, any more than the odd will be. And again, that fire will not be cold any more than the heat in the fire will be. Then, given that the immortal is also indestructible, wouldn't the soul, if it proves to be immortal, be imperishable as well? When death attacks a person, the mortal part, the body, it seems, dies, whereas the immortal part gets out of the way of death, departs, and goes away intact and undestroyed. Beyond all doubt, then, Cebes, the soul is immortal and imperishable, and our souls really will exist in Hades. Well, Socrates, for my part, I have no further objection, nor can I doubt the arguments at this point. So he's convinced Cebes, at least, but I think all of us probably need a little more. Hades, by the way, Hades doesn't mean hell in ancient Greek. It's just a general term for the afterlife, the underworld, whatever it may be, mysterious. What is this strange-sounding argument from opposites? Well, here's the thing. Socrates is going off of this understanding of the soul as the life itself of the body. He's saying that the soul simply is life itself. It is that by virtue of whose presence in the body we call the body a living thing. So, if the soul is life itself, then it is one of those things that has an opposite. Not everything has an opposite. If you ask a kid, what's the opposite of cat, what will he say? Dog. Is dog the opposite of cat? No, they're just two different species. They are definitely not the opposites of each other. That's just a random juxtaposition there. The opposite of desk is not chair. The opposite of the physical things, in other words, physical objects do not have opposites. That doesn't make any sense. But Socrates is saying whatever does have an opposite, we can conclude two things about it. First of all, it comes from its opposite. You only know something that has an opposite by virtue of contrast to its opposite. And that's, by the way, the case with some types of opposites, but not others, as Aristotle shows later. But I don't want to get into that right now. It comes from its opposite, and when it clashes with its opposite, it is not destroyed. Rather, it flees elsewhere and allows its opposite to conquer a given region or space. So, death invades the body. Death competes with life. The opposite of life, of course, is death. We know there's such a thing as life. We know there's such a thing as death. And we can very easily conclude that they are opposites. But what happens then when they compete, as it were, over the same space, over the same thing? Well, one is going to win, and the other is going to go somewhere else. They are not annihilated. Opposites, when they clash, Socrates says, do not annihilate each other ever. Strange as this might sound, it actually seems quite well illustrated by just about any illustration that one can think of. And thankfully, we're here in the summer, and I have a perfect illustration at hand. I shouldn't say it's perfect. No analogy or illustration is perfect, but it helps us to see what Socrates is saying, because we have an air conditioning unit in this room. Thank goodness. And this air conditioning unit is generating cold, you could say. Cold is competing with hot over this room, and thankfully right now it feels just about like cold is won. It has been victorious. Has the heat been annihilated? No. It has been chased elsewhere. Where? Where's the heat that once occupied this room over which the cold was victorious thanks to our air conditioner? Out. What's that? Not here. Does anyone know where exactly it is? Where'd it go? Yeah. Where? You could go find it right now. I could tell you where it is, what door to go out. You go out this given door, you go down couple levels to the basement floor, go out the door directed towards the parking garage, and you'll see right there what? A big condensing unit. And I don't want to dwell too long on an illustration, sorry, I gotta make sure my engineering enthusiasm doesn't get the better of me here. But I love thermodynamic cycles because, well, for their own sake, but they're also good illustrations of this point. The heat has not been annihilated. It has been chased elsewhere by the cold. Same thing with your fridge. I feel like this example has come up in a different context also, but if your air conditioner is broken and you really want to cool down your kitchen, should you just open your fridge? What'll happen? Food will spoil, and what else will happen? What's that? Yeah, it's just you're actually just going to warm up the room. If you just leave your fridge open, your room is going to warm up. That seems strange, doesn't it? It will. You will warm up your room if you leave your fridge open. Why? Has anyone ever felt the back of the fridge? It's very hot. Your fridge doesn't create cold out of nothing. It simply separates cold from heat through this thermodynamic cycle that's the same exact way air conditioning works. It just separates them out. You could say that the cold and the heat are competing over a given space. When one is victorious, its opposite is chased elsewhere. So it's a very fitting analogy for what Socrates is arguing life and death do when they compete over a given body. Eventually, death is victorious, and when it is, that life, being something that has an opposite, is not destroyed, rather it is chased elsewhere. Now, Socrates' argument here also draws heavily from his views on what? Does anyone remember what he draws on that most people today probably wouldn't go for, but certainly common in ancient Greece and other, especially Eastern religions? Reincarnation, yeah. Because he's saying opposites always come from each other. So life, if it's the opposite of death, God bless you, must come from death. But death, if it's the opposite of life, must come from life. In other words, one who was once alive and then died. So his argument from opposites, it doesn't absolutely need reincarnation, but it does work very well with a reincarnation-based view of the afterlife. That there's this eternal cycle of life to death, to life to death, to life to death, because they are opposites. Now you could also argue, using a barely tweaked version of his argument, that life has, in this case, an opposite being the simple absolute non-existence of the soul before a given person was conceived. And that doesn't make any sense physically speaking, because physically speaking it's impossible. There's a philosophical axiom ex nihilo nihil, from nothing, nothing. Fairly straightforward. If you want to get anything, there's got to already be something there that changed forms in order to become the result of the process. It's fairly easy to trace back the matter of a given person Very easy to trace back the matter of a person through their parents. But if a soul exists and it's transcendent and self-existing, where on earth does it come from? Clearly it's not the parents. They give the matter, not the form. They give the DNA, but we've already pointed out that that's not what we're talking about when we refer to the transcendent form of the body. Well, Socrates seems to be inclined towards the view that it comes from a previous life. But if you ask me, that kind of just kicks the can down the road. Eventually you have to ask yourself where it came from in the first place. And eventually you're left back to concluding that it came from nothing. But again, that's impossible, physically. It's not logically impossible. But if something physically impossible happens, what do we call it? Miracle. That's fine by me. That you can either go with Socrates' view on his argument from opposites and say that life comes from life from death, so on and so on, or you can just conclude, you can still use this argument from opposites and just conclude that the life of each person, the existence of the soul of each person is a miracle. Fine by me. Anyway, philosophy has no right to say miracles are impossible. It's just it would be a religious or theological thing to explain them. That would be outside of the domain of philosophy. But philosophy would certainly also be going outside of its domain to pretend it has the right to contradict such things, categorically at least. Okay. That's not his most important argument, though. I didn't give you anything for that in the board. Let me do that. First of all, let me do some erasing. All right. His argument from opposites. Let me try and put that whole thing in a real quick nutshell for your notes. The soul, as life of the body, is the opposite of death. But when opposites clash, one does not annihilate the other. But chases it elsewhere. But rather chases it elsewhere. That, of course, is rather allegorical. Forces it somewhere else. So, interesting argument. But again, not his most important one. His most important one, I'm going to have to give a little bit more time to. His other one that you should have down, let's get his less important one down before we get to his more important one, is the argument from Recollection. And you don't need a big description down for this one. But he tries to argue, and Aristotle would certainly disagree with him here, and I think I do also. That intellectual knowledge is not derived from the senses, but that we have it nevertheless. And if it was not from the senses, it must be something that we are recalling from a previous life. Since we remember things that we did not acquire physically within this life, there must be another life in which we acquired it. If that's true, it's a good argument, but I'm not sure about the premise. Human reason is incredibly powerful in abstracting things from sense input. And we can go so far with a little bit of sensory input that we forget how far we've gone, and one might conclude that one has knowledge completely detached from the senses, when in fact, if you followed it back carefully enough, you'd find that it does go back to what you receive from the senses. But I don't know if he's right. If he's right that we know things that we did not in any way, shape, or form derive from the senses, then yes, this is a valid argument. You know, it must have come from some other type of life that we had or have. All right. Before I get to his more important argument, let me take a look at the dialogue and make sure we're not missing anything here. He says, let's go back to those entities to which we turned in our earlier argument. The reality itself, whose being we give an account of in asking and answering questions, unvarying and constant, or does it vary? Does the beautiful itself, that which each thing itself is, the real, ever admit any change, whatever? Or does that which each of them is, being uniform, alone by itself, remain unvarying and constant, and never admit any kind of alteration? He's talking about the forms. This again is why we had to have our forms discussion before this. He's reiterating to Cebes, look, there are these things. They never change. They are eternal. They are perfect. They are the essences of things. Everything that something is in itself is really a form. These forms never change. But if they never change, they must be immortal. What is the soul like? That which is always changing, or that which never changes? Well, he's going to go through a long back and forth. I don't want to go through all the details of it here. Well, we ourselves, we are part body and part soul, aren't we? We are. Then to which kind do we say that the body will be more similar to? It is clear to anyone, Cebes says, obviously to the visible. Socrates responds, and what about the soul? Is it seen or is it invisible? Cebes says it is not seen. So it's invisible? Yes. The soul then is more similar than the body to the invisible, whereas the body is more similar to that which is seen. Whenever the soul studies alone by itself, it departs yonder toward that which is pure and always existent and immortal and unvarying, and by virtue of its kinship with it, enters always into its company, whenever it has come to be alone by itself. And whenever it may do so, then it has ceased from its wandering, and when it is about those objects, it is always constant and unvarying, because of its contact with things of a similar kind. All right. Socrates is exalting that thing that the philosophers are always after, where the soul has contemplated the forms. When the soul is being enslaved to the service of the body, it's always being dragged asunder, Socrates says, from one trifle to another. But when the soul contemplates the forms, it becomes like them, and it is truly receptive to them. It has an affinity with them. This is his most important argument. The argument from affinity. What is he saying here? Well, let me try and put it in a way that he doesn't, but which might make a little more sense. Might be a little easier, at least. The premise is this: whatever is receptive to a thing exists in its same general order, and it is only capable of receiving it because it is also capable of bearing a similarity to it in its essential characteristics. A few examples before I apply that to this argument. I am receptive to the texture of this wall. My finger is. I don't even need to look at this wall. I can drag my finger across it, and I can receive the texture. I can ascertain, just by dragging my finger across it, that it is rough. Why? How was I capable of doing that? Well, if my finger were made of rigid, solid steel, I wouldn't be able to ascertain the texture of that wall by dragging it across it. But I am able to ascertain its texture because by dragging my finger across it, what does my finger do? Well, it actually acquires the very same texture that it's receiving. Because, your skin has some give to it. It can actually contour to the surface that you push it against, and that is how you can sense the texture of it. How about hearing? You are all hearing my voice right now. How is that possible? Well, as is always the case, whenever one thing is receptive to another, that is only the case because it is capable of bearing a similarity to it in its essential characteristics. Hearing. You hear my voice. Why? Well, your eardrums are literally acquiring a similarity to my voice. Your eardrums are vibrating back and forth with the exact same set of frequencies as my vocal cords are right now. By virtue of the medium of the air, of course. But if your eardrums couldn't do that, you wouldn't be receptive to my voice and you would have no idea what I'm saying. But because the mere fact that you can hear what I'm saying, the mere fact that you know what I'm saying right now proves that your eardrums are acquiring a quite literal similarity to my vocal cords. They have that ability. But this is always the case. Whenever one thing is receptive to another, that proves this similarity. Receptivity of that sort proves similarity in the essential characteristics of the two things. Let's take examples where that is not the case. Let's take a look at the three general categories of beings in the hierarchy of being. First of all, we have inanimate matter. If you have a rock sitting there on the table, it doesn't even exist in the biological order, and it is not receptive to anything in the biological order. A rock, in other words, cannot get sick. You could throw a rock in a vat with bacteria and it would not get sick. A tree can get sick, a plant can get sick, not necessarily always the same sicknesses we can get, but they can certainly get infected. But a plant, although it exists in the biological order, does not exist in the sensitive order. So if I had a potted plant right here, and a terrifying monster walked in the door, what would this plant do about that? Nothing. Wouldn't care. Wouldn't know. It's not receptive to emotion. It does not exist in the sensitive order, and it might as well be in a different universe as fear. It doesn't have the ability to become similar to that. It is not receptive to that. A dog, how might a dog react if it was in the room? It'd run away. Because a dog does exist in the sensitive order. It is receptive to pain, fear, things like that. But let's take it one level higher still. What does a dog think about Socrates' various arguments and mathematics and truth, justice, beauty? Nothing at all. Why? Because a dog does not exist in the rational order. It has a type of intelligence, sure, you can train it, but when it comes to the forms, they are only truly capable of being received by a being who has reason. And yet all of us are capable of receiving the forms. You can receive the forms. You can do your math homework. There's some forms there, rather lowly. You can rise up higher still. You can contemplate goodness, truth, beauty, justice, friendship, nobility, love. These things that you have received by your reason, your will and your reason and your memory acting together, has truly received these forms. But what does that tell us? Well, the forms themselves are eternal, perfect, changeless. Your soul, therefore, in being capable of receiving them, must be capable at least of similarity to them in their essential characteristics, one of which is immortality. So, what is Socrates saying here? Well, if your soul is receptive to the forms, and indeed it is, it must exist in their same order. It must be like them. It must be immortal. try and think about how to put all that quickly. See what I have on my notes. The soul is capable of receiving the forms which are essentially eternal. Let me say which are essentially immortal. Eternal also, but immortality is part of that. The soul is capable of receiving the forms which are essentially immortal, therefore it too must be like them. / exist in their order. If a rock could get sick, then that would all of a sudden prove that it exists in the biological order, and that which pertains to the biological would pertain to the rock. But it can't. But the converse here, when one thing is receptive to something in a given order, it must exist in that order. And what pertains to that order pertains to it as well. So that which is essential to the forms must apply to the human soul also. Now this is the argument that's really important. First of all, it doesn't have some of the potential problems that the argument from opposites and the argument from recollection does. Secondly, it distinguishes a human soul from all other souls. Socrates is not saying animals and plants aren't immortal. He doesn't know, and I certainly don't know. I don't pretend that philosophy can answer that question. But I think it can say pretty confidently this. This doesn't apply to plants and animals, which doesn't mean that dogs don't go to heaven, as the movie says. What's that? Some movie about that? It just has nothing to say about that question as well. So, let's take a look at arguments against. These aren't too prevalent in the dialogue. We certainly saw a couple of objections to the immortality of the soul, but they weren't given much space. But it wouldn't be right for us to leave them out entirely here. Okay. First of all, the most obvious is that materialism presupposes a worldview, that dismisses the possibility of transcendence. This is not an argument against the immortality of the soul, it is simply an a priori dismissal of it. A priori meaning before the fact. Certain things in philosophy must be granted a priori. That is to say, the logical first principles. They cannot be proven because they must not be proven, not because they're false, but because they're too basic to prove. If this were presented as an argument, that would be a major fallacy, because the immortality of the soul, or the lack of immortality of the soul, is not something that can be granted or rejected a priori. So, although I'm putting this down because this is what you'll see a lot, we should bear in mind that this is no argument. To simply say we are a hunk of cells and that's it is not an argument, it's just an assertion of a view. A somewhat more subtle one would be this. I had a philosophy professor at RPI who this was his view. This is how he argued his view. All soul functions, in quotes, because they're not granting the existence of a transcendent soul. All soul functions can be described neurochemically, therefore the soul, God bless you, is just an epiphenomenon, meaning an apparent secondary phenomenon of neurochemistry. First of all, its premise is not proven, but that's okay. For the sake of argument, let's take its premise for granted. That everything that one would ordinarily say a soul does is actually a process that can be described neurochemically. Love, appreciation of the noble things, memory, thinking. I could go on and on. All these various things that one would generally say is done by the soul. I will not deny that all such processes can be identified neurochemically. The question is what logically follows from that. I'm just reminded, actually, this also may have come up earlier, but there was a study that came out recently that says that neurochemically love, romantic love, falling in love, is the same as, anyone see this study? Eating chocolate. I don't know who they studied, someone who really likes chocolate, but or someone who doesn't really like falling in love, but whatever it is, even if that's true, what does that prove? Well, the question here, whenever two phenomena are linked, major questions remain. And let me put an illustration on the board to demonstrate that point. You don't need this down. This is true, though. There was a given locale, and the data collected in what transpired in this locale proved what I'm about to put in the board. It didn't prove it. It showed it. Data doesn't prove or disprove anything. Data, of course, doesn't interpret itself, but this is what the data itself consisted in. In case you can't read those axes. As ice cream sales goes up, drowning deaths go up. Any interpretations of the data? Shall we outlaw ice cream? Ice cream is killing people. It's causing them to drown. We got to get rid of ice cream. Is that the proper conclusion to draw? Correlation, exactly. We all know that. We've all been introduced to this distinction before of correlation versus causation. Merely identifying the two phenomena are linked is less than half the battle. Maybe it's not even 1% of the battle. I don't know. Depends on the context, certainly. But in this case, even if this is true, and that certainly remains to be proven, most soul functions can't be described neurochemically. Sure, there's a theory chalked up for everything, but that doesn't mean it's any more than simple conjecture. Just because somebody with a PhD after their name writes something in a supposedly peer-reviewed journal doesn't necessarily prove anything. But anyway, I think about memory. You can mess with all sorts of parts of the brain, and that can mess with certain memories, certainly. But they've never found a memory. We can't find memories. Again, we can find parts of the brain that are involved in their use, but they've never actually found a memory. When you have data on your phone that's, quote, on the cloud, is that this mysterious data that's floating around somewhere in energy waves? When you have data on the cloud, where is it? It's in a hard drive in a physical spot somewhere. There's no mystery about it. It's just that your phone, when it's on the cloud, it just means it's on somebody else's hard drive and you download it when you need it. There's no mystery there. We know exactly where that data is. But neurochemists have never, and neuroscientists and psychologists, they've never actually identified a literal memory in the brain. We can't find them. I would wager it's because they're not in the brain, they're in the soul. Anyway, they also say that we have a memory, even if we are limited in our ability to access them, of everything we've ever seen. I don't know if that's true or not, but if it is, the sheer quantity of data that we have in our memory far exceeds anything that's possible to physically store within the given space of our skulls. All right, I'm digressing here. The point here is that even if this is true, it doesn't prove, first of all, that there's a causation. Secondly, which direction the causation flows in. Analyze this. Everything that a car does can be described in terms of what its steering wheel, brake pedal, and gas pedal do. Therefore, there is no driver. In an automatic transmission, at least. The premises are valid. Everything that a car does on the road, you can fully define and describe in terms of 3 inputs. The gas pedal, the brake pedal, the steering wheel. 3 simple numbers could fully describe all of the operations a car undertakes on the road. What can and cannot one conclude from that? Oh yeah. I suppose I should throw some other things in there. Blinkers and flattened headlights. Yeah, so if steering column, yeah, that's true. So I could expand the inputs a little bit and get everything. If my attempt was to prove that there is no driver, I have of course miserably failed my attempt, because all I've done is proven that the steering column, the brake pedal, and the gas pedal are parts of a causal chain. Merely identifying that one thing is part of a causal chain doesn't prove that it is the top link, it just proves that it's in there. I don't suppose anyone denies that, well, a strict dualist, Descartes, even he, might deny that the brain is at all involved in soul functions, but most people who believe in a transcendent self-existing soul don't deny that the brain operates in concert with the soul. And everything the soul does, sure, it affects the brain. But just because everything the soul does has a neurochemical effect doesn't prove that there isn't a soul, that it's just neurochemistry. It just proves that neurochemistry is one link in the causal chain. This doesn't prove the existence of a soul either. It just points out that this particular argument against it's invalid. If we could easily continue the analogy, and it would work well with modern technology, because not all cars do have drivers. Around here, I think they all do, but they're testing out driverless cars in some places. So if you wanted to philosophically investigate and try and conclude rationally whether a given car had a driver or did not have a driver, the mere fact that you can describe what it does in terms of its 2 pedals and its steering column would be insufficient in determining one way or the other. You'd need other methods. I don't know how exactly you go about that. But analogously here, the driver, of course, would be analogous to the soul, the neurochemistry analogous to the pedals and the steering column. More exploration would be necessary, is the point, to actually come to a rational conclusion. You'd need to, well, I don't know, I haven't taken the analogy this far before. Maybe every analogy becomes pointless if you take it too far, but where exactly that point arises is never certain. Could look in the window, see if there's a driver in there or not, but that would be analogous not to philosophy, but to probably theology or something like that. Anyway, don't know where else to take that analogy other than to simply point out that I think it helps us to see why this argument that my very anti-soul immortality philosophy professor from RPI put forth is simply not logical, and I'm surprised he didn't see that. It's not justified based on the premises. Anyway, I don't. There are certainly other arguments, but I don't have any more down here in my lecture notes. So, nothing too essential to have down on that. You know, there is one more thing I can't help but bring up, because a lot of students have heard of this. This is finally a serious academic inquiry. The University of Connecticut, some other universities in America actually have huge reserves of scientific studies on certain events that are trying to shed more light on this question scientifically. Anyone know what I'm getting at? It's finally taken academically seriously, as it should be. Near-death experiences. They're very worth looking into. And I'm not an expert in these, so take it with a grain of salt if you like. But time and time again, there's a given scenario that has been documented, recorded repeatedly. And the scenario is this. Someone's in the hospital. They're on the operating table, the emergency room maybe, and this is not supposed to be anatomically correct. I'm just trying to draw a stick figure here. Okay. This is too awkward. I gotta erase this and try again. All right, there's my stick figure. He's on the operating table. There's some doctors and nurses around him. But there's also like a shelf here. And this is, I'm not describing any one specific study. This is just a pattern that keeps being observed empirically, again, very well documented. And there's a bunch of stuff up here, a bunch of pill bottles and devices and who knows what else. Completely impossible for him to see physically. Furthermore, he's under he's being scanned by various devices that find no heartbeat, no brainwave activity whatsoever. And he's like that for maybe 15 minutes, I don't know. And then he comes to, out of nowhere. And that in and of itself is amazing enough, but that's not the point. The amazing thing is what? Time and time again, the person who comes back can do what? Exactly. He can describe in perfect detail what was up here. He couldn't see it. There was no possible way for him to see it. Now, sure, they often come back with all sorts of stories also, and those are interesting and worth reading, but they don't philosophically prove anything, because you could just argue that it was just a dream. You could argue that this is what? Well, you could argue it's a lucky guess, but that explanation only works for so many instances. You could argue it's a conspiracy. He had a friend in the hospital who told him what was up there. But when this becomes a pattern, and time again, we see this happening, that people who have these experiences of the soul leaving the body briefly know things that have been objectively verified as true, and yet they had absolutely no bodily way of knowing. It's not exactly difficult to rationally, philosophically conclude from those premises that the only way he can have that knowledge is by virtue of something that transcends the body. With every passing year, every time we have more documented cases of these, it gets more and more ridiculous to try to write it all off as conspiracy. That would be one for the history books, if it were one. Anyway, just throwing that out there. Certainly not something I'm going to test you on, certainly not something you need down, but I find it very interesting, worth looking into more. These are, again, you'll find all sorts of weird pseudoscientific stuff associated with people who promote this stuff, unfortunately, but the studies themselves in the archives of these universities are fully scientific and very empirical, very well documented. All right, let's polish off this dialogue real quick so I can squeeze in one more discussion sheet before we run out of time. He's about to, Socrates, as I often say, when he knows he's going to get to a clincher moment, and he's about to do this with his argument from opposites, he warms up his interlocutor with a little pep talk, maybe it's just a phrase even. And in this case, he admonishes Cebes, do not give the old, safe, ignorant answer. I always triple highlight that in here because that is a gem. An old, safe, ignorant answer. We are all chock full of them, aren't we? It's like we've got a whole repertoire of them ready to whip out at the drop of a hat when we realize that something we do or something we believe is being challenged. Old, safe, ignorant answers. Has anyone heard anybody give an old, safe, ignorant answer? Any examples? Too bad. Exactly. Just flippant dismissal, which is like a too bad. It's like I don't care. It's like, oh, do you want a judge to say that when you're falsely accused of a crime? Is there another one?
How are you? I'm good.
I'm good. Okay, I'm good. If that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that as an old, safe, ignorant answer, but yeah, if there's really something going on and you don't want to admit it.
Relying on tradition, just saying it's the
way it's always been done. Exactly. Old, safe, ignorant answer. It's always been done that way. Momentum is its own justification. Or how about even just the same basic type of answer, just looking at the present moment. Everybody's doing it. As if that justifies anything. As if truth were determined by majority vote. It's just the way I am, when in fact it's the way you're choosing to be. So, and I'm not that any of those answers are brought up here, but those are the things that come to my mind that Socrates is cautioning us against by saying, do not give the old, safe, ignorant answer, because I have plenty of them. I know we all have them. We've got to be on guard against giving them when we are morally challenged. All right, but anyway, that's him warming up Siebes for his argument from opposites, which we've already gone through. So let's skip through all of this. And now he's at the end of his arguments, and he has some admonitions that are very significant. Given that the soul is evidently immortal, that, I think, is fitting and worth risking. For one who believes that it is so, it is a noble risk that one should Sorry, that was a bit out of context. Let me skip. One should repeat such things to oneself like a spell, which is just why I've so prolonged the tale. For these reasons, any man should have confidence for his own soul, God bless you, who during his life has rejected the pleasures of the body and its adornments as alien, thinking they do more harm than good, and has devoted himself to the pleasures of learning, and has decked his soul with no alien adornment, but rather with its own, temperance, justice, bravery, liberality, truth, thus awaiting the journey he will make to Hades whenever destiny shall summon him. Now as for you, Simmias and Cebes and the rest, you will make your several journeys at some future time, but from myself, even now, as a tragic hero might say, destiny doth summon me, and it's just about time I took my bath. It really seems better to take a bath before drinking the poison, not to give the women the trouble of washing a dead body. So he goes from all these lofty things, admonitions, to I'm going to go take a bath now. But it was charitable of him. He was in his most extremely difficult moments of his life thinking of others, not wanting to bother these poor women, probably his wife also, with having to wash a dead body. But in that whole paragraph, which is great, and I always like to read, I have one little gem especially highlighted here. He's admonishing us to repeat these things to ourselves like a spell. To repeat it to yourself like a spell. That seems so weird. Why does he use the example of a spell? Well, he's not encouraging sorcery, that's for sure. But he's using that as the example because just admit it. If you knew some spell that created $10 whenever you said it, what might you spend your days doing? Saying that spell. Don't do that, but that's just an illustration of the point he's making here, which is a spell, it would be something recited constantly. To remind oneself of the truths that he has discovered through his philosophizing is a task even more important, perhaps, than simply exerting the effort at first to arrive at them. Because the biggest risk, the biggest thing that draws one away from the good life, the life directed at truth and goodness, is not so much a firm, specific decision to leave the good life, it's what? Most people who just are not living a good life, did they just wake up one morning and decide to not live a good life? Mostly not. Maybe some. Most of them just drifted into that. No one's born bad. No one's born like that. So we're all born in different circumstances, but you drift. If you don't specifically, constantly remind yourself of what you know is true, you're going to start to slowly but surely forget it over time. And when you slowly but surely forget it, there's one thing you're not going to forget. And what's that? The lower desires. Because the lower desires are constantly foisting themselves upon us. And I don't know of anyone who's really fully been delivered from that. The desires for pleasure and comfort and money and safety and popularity and power, those low desires are always tugging at us. And if we do not counter them by constantly reminding ourselves of what we should be directing ourselves towards, those lower desires are going to cause us to drift away from the life we actually wanted to live, and the life we know we should live. So he's begging us to repeat these things to ourselves like a spell. And I'm not going to tell you what to repeat to yourself like a spell, but choose it wisely. Decide who you want to be, and live every single day as a consequence of that decision. And that will only happen if you constantly repeat it. Do spouses just say, I love you once and then it's done because they said it? No, it's every day at least. Why? Because it's so important. That which is so important must be constantly repeated. And whatever that is for you, decide what it is. I know what it is for me. I repeat it dozens, if not hundreds of times a day. We need that. We all need that. Otherwise, we will drift. No one wants to drift. So let's heed Socrates' admonition there. Then they ask, how should we bury you? What is his famous response to that? If you can catch me. Because by you, they are saying what? Yeah. Whenever you refer to what a thing is, you are referring to its essence. But whenever you refer to an essence, you refer to a form. But the form of the body is the soul. So by saying, how should we bury you? If you say that to someone, you're implying that you're going to bury them alive. Which Socrates knows what they mean, but he's pointing out that they're not being careful with their words. He's being a stickler, in other words. And that's fine. Socrates is a stickler. That's what he does. And sure, he's a bit overboard with this stickling. I don't know if that's a verb. He's a bit overboard with this stickling at times, but he also always has a point. And this is a very important one. This reminds me of Confucianism's rectification of names. It's one of its key doctrines of Confucianism, is that things must always be referred to in accordance with what they are, never what they are not. Euphemisms are very dangerous because we start believing ourselves if we lie to ourselves often enough. A thing is what it is, and we must name it in accordance with what it is. Death, burying, is done to a body, a corpse. I will not be with you, he is saying, when I drink the poison. You will not bury me. So he's fine with them burying him however they want to. He says, you can be sure, my dear Crito, that the misuse of words is not only troublesome in itself, it actually has a bad effect in the soul. Then the prison official came in, and he says, in your time here, I've known you for the most generous and gentlest and best of men who has ever come to this place. And the prison official himself was in tears. So, the fruits, we started this dialogue seeing the fruits of good philosophy, and now that the moment itself has come for him to drink the poison, the fruits have not departed. The fruits are still there. But this isn't particular to Socrates. You often see this in the life of a good philosopher who's come to death in some way like this. I'm thinking of Thomas More, who was a philosopher and a statesman, second highest person in England, in fact, in the 1500s. Chancellor, I believe. Henry VIII had him killed. because, like Socrates, he stuck to his principles, wouldn't contradict them. His last words before he died wasn't exactly the same as Socrates, but he was just joking with the executioner, telling him not to mess up his beard that he had so carefully grown in his years of imprisonment as he was being beheaded. And then he forgave the executioner and said, basically, don't worry about it, you're just doing your job. So how one approaches death, that's the ultimate test. And it's no longer at all theoretical for Socrates, but the moment itself is upon him. Plenty of other noble souls have approached that fate similarly. So he drinks it down. He reprimands those present for crying over him and not being calm. And there again is his final words to Crito, reminding him to sacrifice this rooster to the god Asclepius, a final act of piety from the man condemned to death for his alleged impiety. And the dialogue ends back with Phaedo himself saying to Socrates, and that Socrates was the end of our companion, a man who among those of his time we knew was, so we should say, the best, the wisest too, and the most just. And there's Socrates. We're still not done with him yet, though. He's dead, but we still got more to say. Not so much after that dialogue, but the next question that one might have about the soul is conveniently one that Plato answers for us. So we got this soul, we're stuck with it for all eternity. Well, naturally, one should want to take care of it well. Plato has some advice on that as well. He gives it in many different cases, but my favorite, and I think the most enjoyable to go over, is his allegory of the Chariot. So let's cover this real quick, and then we will call it a day. This discussion sheet is unlike any other. I find it a bit weird when I hand it to you. Yeah, this one's laid out landscape, so you might want to take one of these. All right, success. Oops. Okay. First thing I need to say very clearly and openly at this point is that I am embellishing this allegory. I have a number of things that I want to go over in this allegory that are not specifically contained in how Plato phrases it in Phaedrus, which is the dialogue that it is presented in. I do that unashamedly because, remember, this is a philosophy course, not a history course. I'm a big fan of ancient Greek philosophy as the best way to do intro philosophy, but I don't believe in arbitrarily sticking to every little detail of the history, as long as I am open with when I am embellishing things, which I am here. I'm trying to squeeze in a number of concepts into this same allegory, also from ancient Greek philosophy, but more than Plato himself included within it. And I'll be clear about that as I put it on the board here. So this class is really the one where you're going to wonder why I'm not an art professor. We have a chariot and we have two horses. And we have a charioteer in the chariot as well, of course. Now these horses happen to have wings. I'm going to not even bother trying with the wings. There's one horse, tail, and here's another horse, tail. Now I got to draw their faces though. These are not headless horses. Yeah, I'm going to go for an oval. The head. So the horses are very different. This is the key. I got to make sure you don't need to draw horses in your sheet, by the way. You can if you want. I'll give you what you need for your sheet when I put the words on the board. This horse up here is the noble horse. So he's his eyebrows like this, and he's smiling. This horse right here is the dark horse. So his eyebrows like that, and he's got big angry teeth. All right. So we got these two horses. We got a squiggly line. We've got a destination. And we've got this mysterious star up here. We got to fill out what all these things are. First of all, a couple words from Plato himself, or Socrates. Got quotes in a couple different spots here. He goes through this whole lengthy exposition on the soul. In Phaedrus also he talks a lot about the immortality of the soul. I believe he does in the Republic also, if I'm not mistaken. The argument of Phaedrus is very interesting. You don't need it down. It's not in Phaedo, but he talks about anything that is self-moved must be immortal because it must be a form of sorts, which is interesting. Anything truly self-moved, everything. Now that would kind of apply to animals also, and perhaps plants, but anything that is alive seems to have the principle of its own motion within itself. Not truly self-moved, but its motion does not need to be externally imparted to it. But anyway, I don't want to go into that right now. I'm opening this up for the sake of the Chariot allegory. That then is enough about the soul's immortality, Socrates says. Now here is what we must say about its structure. To describe what the soul actually is would require a very long account, altogether a task for a god in every way. But to say what it is like is humanly possible, and takes less time. So let us do it the second way in our speech. Let us then liken the soul to the natural union of a team of winged horses and their charioteer. The gods have horses and charioteers that are all good and come from good stock, while everyone else is a mixture. To begin with, our driver is in charge of a pair of horses. The second, one of his horses, is beautiful and good, and from a stock of the same sort, while the other is the opposite, and has the opposite sort of bloodline. This means that the chariot driving in our case is inevitably a painful and difficult business. He goes all through all sorts of colorful explanations of these winged chariots, these winged horses pulling the chariot through all these different circuits in the heavens, and he gets into the gods and this theory of recollection, and don't want to go into all that right now. Let me just quickly see if I had anything else that I wanted to say about how he phrases the allegory. He gives I don't know why he finds this important, but he describes how these horses look in some detail. And I read this just because it's interesting, but last year I had a student who drew an amazing picture of the Chariot allegory. And I hope she put it online or something, because there's not very many good ones online about this. Just as at the beginning of this tale we divided each soul into three forms, two like horses and the third like a charioteer, let this now still stand. The first of the two is on the nobler side. There's our noble horse. Erect in form, clean-limbed, high-necked, nose somewhat hooked, white in color with black eyes, a lover of honor, when joined with restraint and a sense of shame, and a companion of true glory, needing no whip, responding to the spoken command alone. The other is crooked in shape, gross, a random collection of parts, with a short, powerful neck, flat-nosed, gray-eyed, bloodshot, companion of excess and boastfulness, shaggy around the ears, deaf, hardly yielding to whip and goad together. Wow, there's our two horses. What is the point of that description? Well, it's all symbolic of how they behave. But again, I'm going to embellish this a bit. So, the key is to recognize who must be in the chariot. Plato famously says the human soul has three parts, but really it's better. That's what I have in your sheet. I think I called it tripart. Yeah, so it's often referred to as this tripartite soul teaching. That's a bit misleading because a part implies a difference in substance. Like the body has parts, but the soul doesn't have parts in the same sense because it's simple. It's truly, absolutely one being. So it's better to say that it has different faculties, but because Plato says parts, I'll stick with that. And what are these parts? Well, Plato, whether or not you agree with him that these are the three parts, I don't personally, but I still find his teachings very, very insightful, are logos. noble horse up here, thumos. The ignoble horse down here, eros. He says these are the three parts of the human soul. We have, above all, this faculty that ought always be in the chariot, holding the reins. And I just realized how stupidly I drew this for a number of reasons, but really, these reins need to be in his hands. They're not just arbitrarily hooked up to the chariot itself. He's holding them. And what is this logos? Well, this would be the reasoning part of the soul. We'll want that down as well, that this is the logos or the reasoning part. And why is the reasoning in the chariot? Well, we'll see that shortly. But what is pulling the chariot forward? The reason alone by itself doesn't really have enough strength to move this chariot forward. It has great power in its ability to discover the truth. Why? Because it can see the destination, it can see the path, and it can hear the directions. But it doesn't have enough strength to really pull the chariot. For that, the horses are needed. And they have wings, as their wings. So, what pulls us forward? Well, thumos and eros. The desire, this unfortunately tends to do more pulling in most people. The desiring part of the soul, and thumos, the aspiring. Now, Plato describes these rather black and white, which I think is dangerous, helpful in some ways, dangerous in others. We'll talk about both aspects. This is just, as far as he's concerned, the good horse, and this is the bad horse. But really, we should acknowledge that that's an oversimplification. Aristotle gives much more balanced views, which is why I'm going to bring some of his insights into here. Neither is good, or in truth, we should admit that neither is good or bad in and of itself. They simply both must be what? Subservient to the logos. The logos must always do the directing of the chariot, never the horses, never the thumos or the eros, because they don't know what path they should follow, and they don't know what the destination is. They always do what? They simply pull blindly towards what their nature is inclined. The dark horse is inclined towards what? Pleasure. Desiring of pleasure, comfort, money. Money could go under either, so let me just, the lower desires. Power. You know what? Let me just stick with pleasure for now. I'm not going to complicate things too much if I let this list get too big. Desiring pleasures. Aspiring. The words sound similar. We are moving towards something with both aspiration and with desiring. But it is no accident that one sounds like you're going up, ascending, aspiring, and one sounds like you're going down, descending, desiring. And yes, that's a simplification, but it helps. And it's no accident that we think about up, higher things as the loftier pursuits, and lower things as the less noble pursuits. That is actually often referred to in ancient Greek in bodily imagery. The higher desires, the desires that should really move you forward and that you should dedicate yourself to, are the desires of the head, the desires of the heart. The logos and the aspiration, the thumos. The lower desires, bodily as well, the desires of the stomach, the desires of the genitals. Those are considered the ignoble desires that one should not follow. Now, that again is an oversimplification. Why? Well, because we really do need both horses. We need the strength that both of them give. Aspiration for glory. Desire, for pleasure. But if we're so careful to keep it subservient to the reins that are held only by the logos. Whenever it pulls contrary to justice, the logos is not doing that directing, but the eros horse is doing its own directing. Now here is also the thing. Practically speaking, the vast majority of the time, Plato's absolutely right. We got to basically beat that horse into submission. so that we are not constantly chasing after pleasures. Because this is the overarching temptation that is always pulling us off of this path. Well, what's this path? It's squiggly, I'll talk about that in a moment. The path that the soul must follow, well, that's what Socrates has been talking about this whole time. Justice. And we mean that in the broadest sense of the word, like virtue in general. The path is justice. But as we'll see in Aristotle, as you'll see in your reading for next class, justice is the path. It is the necessary path, but it is not the destination. Virtue, this is not sufficiently highlighted in Socrates. Justice is absolutely necessary. Virtue is absolutely necessary. But Aristotle would not agree that virtue is its own reward. He would say that virtue actually leads to something superior, leads to something beyond itself. That's something that we want for its own sake. What is it that we all want for its own sake? We want to be what? What's that? Hopefully, I sure hope we all want to be that. Even those who don't want to be good, they at least want to be happy. Happiness. But the Greek word for this, which would be good to have down also, is eudaimonia, which means so much more than what people generally mean by the word happy. Happy is not supposed to simply mean you're feeling amused and enjoying yourself in a given time. Eudaimonia, the Greek word, sometimes pronounced eudaimonia, sometimes pronounced eudaimonia, it is usually translated as happiness, and all intro philosophy courses talk about the translation of eudaimonia, so that's what we'll do now. But really, it means what the Greeks meant by eudaimonia was human flourishing. It is like blessedness. It is a human being everything that a human being ought to be. It is the totality of the good life. Human flourishing. Sure, we can say happiness, but really it involves all of those fruits. Joy, peace, tranquility, blessedness, just contentment. Those are the things that we want for their own sake. Add them all together, we have this thing called eudaimonia, human flourishing. The lower substitutes for eudaimonia are what the horses drive towards. The horses are always pulling towards what they are naturally inclined towards. One horse is always pulling you towards pleasure. The other horse is always pulling you towards this other desire that you have, more fittingly called an aspiration. And yes, it's better, but this is also dangerous. Let's talk about that for a moment. The danger of the dark horse, the Eros horse, is obvious.
It's about the you or we.
Thumos.
No, eudaimonia.
Oh, eudaimonia, that would be you, yes, you. We all know what kind of a life arises from the Eros horse being allowed to pull in contradiction to the charioteer's reins, being able to do the directing of the chariot, in other words. This would be the hedonism of Callicles. The couch potato, the glutton, the playboy, the drug addict, those are the lives wherein the dark horse is allowed to pull in contradiction to the logos. Now this is not a big part of what Socrates is talking about with this allegory, but this is also a serious danger that's not as popular a danger as descending into a life of hedonism, but it is a danger nevertheless. What happens if we let this horse do all the pulling instead of being subservient to the reins of the logos? What kind of a life is that?
It would be greedy.
Yeah, greed, that you become a ruthless tyrant, ruthless business person. You could, even if not that, what ism broadly encapsulates the various lifestyles one might arrive in if his incessant desire for his own personal glory dominates? Egoism, right? And we saw a lot of this, we see a lot of this everywhere, but certainly in the ancient Greek world, with these conquerors deciding arbitrarily that they're going to go starting wars with nearby regions. Why? That's glorious. Conquer some more regions, it's glorious. I'll get more honors and glories, which is, of course, ridiculous. But as always, philosophy should lead all of us to a better life. It shouldn't just give us the ammunition to condemn the few and the far between. What more common lifestyles, perhaps among our own peers, arise from letting one's desire for personal glory dominate? I have a proposition. How about Facebook obsession? How about some people do everything they do for the sake of making their Facebook profile look cooler? Like everything they do, they have one question in mind. How can I get the best selfies at this event so that my social media profiles will look even cooler, so that more people will think I'm awesome and I'll be more popular? There's no reason in that. That is ridiculous. The Logos is not doing the directing of the chariot in that case. The Thumos is doing all sorts of pulling on its own. And of course, no analogy is perfect. Certainly not anything as complex as a soul. The Aerosaurus could be subtly involved in that same scheming. But this gets me to my next very important point. When I first started doing this discussion, I had the squiggly line here straight, perfectly down the middle, in between the two horses. And I realized just how problematic that was, because I was misleading people inadvertently. Because I started seeing on students' papers observations like this. The lesson I learned from Plato's tripartite soul is that in order to make sure you're leading the good life towards happiness, you need to just make sure that the Thumos and the Eros horse are pulling equally hard. Which is the opposite of what I'm trying to say. That's not going to make you virtuous. That's just going to make you an egotistical hedonist. It's going to be the worst of both worlds. The point is not to let either horse do its own pulling. I mean, let them both pull, but let them only pull in accordance with what reason dictates is virtuous and directed towards the good life, the happy life. And this, of course, is where the analogy breaks down, because that would just rip the chariot in half. But I made it squiggly because the path is still objective. It's still a real path that objectively exists. It's not just you identify whatever path you prefer. It's the path of the virtue. It's the only one that actually leads to happiness, ultimately. But it is not obvious, it is not easy, and it is not a matter, if you just did some physics 101 here and just did some vector addition, sure. Both horses pulling equally strongly at a 45-degree angle would lead this down the middle. But that's not how it works in real life, because the Logos looks at a given situation and determines what in that situation is the right thing to do, in accordance with objective principles, yes, but every situation, of course, is different. There's a great quote from the movie Lincoln, 2012. Anyone see that? Great movie. But there was somebody was reprimanding Lincoln for being too willing to compromise. A very zealous abolitionist was very angry at Lincoln, and I don't know how historical this is, but it was